My faux pas of not pressing the button before I start. Welcome to you all to the April meeting of the Climate Change Policy and Scrutiny Committee. We'll start by asking for declarations of interest. Not seeing anyone rushing. The next item will be, I should point out, if anyone needs the toilets, they're out that way. And the stairs are also out that way in the unlikely event of there being an emergency. So to move on to the minutes, I understand that the minutes that we have here, unfortunately, are the minutes for last March's meeting and not the March 22 meeting. So we won't be considering these today, and we will be looking at them, the minutes at the next meeting that we have. So we've not got anything to consider there. Which then takes us neatly on to public participation. We've got 8 speakers wanting to talk on our agenda today, which I think is a general indication of how seriously both of the subjects on our agenda are taken by the city at large. So I'd like to welcome each of you. I think there are 3 speaking in public and 5 are speaking remotely. So I'll call, first of all, Debbie Cobbett, who she's not here. Okay. The next speaker then is Flick Williams, who I understand is speaking remotely. Are you there?
Good evening. I am. Can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear. You've got 3 minutes.
I recognise the need for action on the climate emergency. I am not against active travel, merely questioning your plan for those of us for whom it is not an option. Where is the plan for disabled people and their access needs within the desire for modal shift? Or is it in fact absent from any calculation you make, just as we were absent from the council's latest video offering, dubbed in my circles the Active Travel Horror Show? Not a single visibly disabled or older person throughout, a vision of York from which we have been socially cleansed. Pretending disabled people and their access needs do not exist does not make it so. As I read your report, for us, you create a lose-lose situation. At one end of the journey, you take away our blue badge car parking in the foot streets, and in 2, soon to be 3 car parks to make way for EV infrastructure. At the other end of the journey, you build low or 0 car streets, building in all the access problems disabled people are taking their boroughs to court over in the LTNs imposed on people in the south. We are not other, we are 20% of the population across all impairment categories. I applaud the enthusiasm for passive house technology, but where is the same enthusiasm for lifetime home standards? When I worked in access, I visited a new estate in Greenwich built by Harbinteg, and I invite you to take a look at their developments as a means of eliminating the disabled facilities grants of the future. Failing to recognise the needs of disabled people in both housing and transport is neither inclusive nor sustainable. The National Planning Policy Framework is being amended to reflect the government's Building Beautiful Places plan, telling as to their priorities, I think. From your report, we are missing our access needs left unaddressed by omission, but in the wider policy debate, we become victims of eco-ableism, the groupthink that tells us your access needs are costing us the earth. It denies us our essential vehicles when we cannot make modal shift. It tells us our need for plastic drinking straws is costing the ocean. It puts signs in public buildings telling us to think of the energy used by taking the lift when we cannot take the stairs. Summarised, inclusion has come to mean almost everything but the elimination of exclusion. What happened to the principles of no climate justice without social justice? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we will obviously be considering the points you've raised in our discussion. Thank you, Flick. The next person we have is Mr. Dave Merritt, who has also speaking to us remotely.
Yep. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak. I have to say I read the climate change strategy report and was really disappointed in two main respects. The first is in terms of ambition. To describe the proposed trend that's identified in it as high ambition is frankly greenwash. It's inadequate ambition. In fact, if you actually look at the percentage reductions by 2030 and 2035, they're actually less than the government's own ambitions, UK government's own announced ambitions. So it's really just not up to the job. And I think the second reason I'm disappointed is it's 3 years since the council declared a climate emergency. We're almost 30% of the way to 2030, where you declared an ambition of being to net zero. And we're still discussing policy and strategy rather than actually the more detailed actions that need to be occurring now. You know, if you just look at the main area of York's Scope 1 and 2 emissions, which is building emissions, then you know there's 86,000 properties in this city, most of which, as the Climate Change Commission identifies, need to be retrofitted and their heat and energy systems changed and upgraded. And that's, you know, 3,000 properties a year if you run it to 2050. It's 11,000 properties a year if you tried to run it to 2030. So, you know, where are we on this? We're nowhere. This really does need to change. You know, it's clearly difficult. You know, it's the biggest challenge that this city and this country and the world has faced in terms of the scale and speed of change that's required. We really need to, you know, work with all residents, be absolutely engaged with all residents in terms of how we face up to this challenge and how we make the change. We won't achieve it otherwise. Turning to the local transport plan, I know that my colleague...
You have 40 seconds just to let you know. Okay.
My colleague in the Civic Trust, Tony May, would very much, I think, have wanted to be here, but it is unfortunately not available. The Civic Trust's Transport Advisory Group has done a lot of work looking at what could be done in terms of the local transport plan. And, you know, I think it's well worth a look at. And I'd encourage the committee to perhaps consider inviting Tony May to actually give a presentation on their work that they've done, which I think would be quite helpful to you. And it does obviously also pick up how we might meet the transport decarbonisation challenge. But what I'd say here is I think we've got the same question and the same challenge. Are we going to step up to the big issues, or are we just going to continue doing as in effect the council has done for a long period of time, tinkering at the edges? You know, are we really going to sort the decarbonisation of transport
wind up
and to tackle the congestion problems in this city? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the points you've made. Am I right in believing that I've seen Debbie Cobbett arrive? Yes, I thought I had. I will then call you, Debbie, to speak now. You have 3 minutes.
You've only just been told to come upstairs.
That's okay.
Switched on. Yes, that's
Yes.
better. So thank you. Well, as Lisa Nandy said about the levelling up strategy, is this it? 3 years since a climate emergency was declared. It's just as well that Keith Aspen's piece says history will judge us by how we adapt, because you've had 3 years to mitigate. And, you know, the resilience aspect becomes more and more important. I'd just like to pick you up as usual on the granularity of your data, because you talk about carbon footprints. You say that the average annual carbon footprint of a York citizen has reduced from 6.9 tonnes to 3.8 tonnes, which this is since 2005. Well, I am flabbergasted because the World Wildlife Fund footprint checker thinks that my footprint is around 6 tonnes and the average in the UK is 10. And you are saying that the York average is 3.8. The university did research about Derwentthorpe and our carbon footprints there. Very big for the wealthy owner-occupiers, a lot smaller for the people in affordable accommodation, but still nowhere near that 3.8. So I really wonder where you've got that from. I really would like, as Dave said, to see you doing a lot more. And I, once again, would like to recommend that you look at what's going on in Leeds. They're having a Zoom on the 28th of April, Climate Action Leeds. You can Google it. And it's about building the Leeds donut. Councillor Vassy hosted a meeting about donut economics with Kate Rayworth, and I thought he was fairly favourable to that. So I suggest you go along, Climate Action Leeds. And next time the Environment Forum approach you to help with York Environment Week, perhaps you'll do a little bit more this September. Thank you. I think I'm under time.
Thank you for your contribution, and obviously we'll be paying attention to what you said when we get to discussing all this. Our next speaker is a remote speaker, Kate Locke. Are you there, Kate?
Yes, good afternoon. I'm there. Before you put the clock on, I've been to the dentist this afternoon. My face is quite frozen, so if I sound a bit strange, that's why.
Okay.
Yeah, I might. So I'd like to talk just about the draft climate change strategy, which I've been through in detail, but the points I will make are 3 points. So the first point is about what's not included in the strategy. There's no vision for the strategy itself, and having a vision is fundamental to any strategy. Otherwise, what's the strategy working towards? There's a generic statement that's far too vague to be useful for a climate change strategy. There's insufficient information about the policy, the wider policy context from the international down to the regional and the local, and how this sits and relates to those to that policy context. There's very little scientific detail or analysis about climate risks. There's just 2 paragraphs. There needs to be much more on this. It's not just flooding, which I know there's a separate strategy for. It's the impact of heat on a variety of things, water shortages, risks to natural capital, the risks of emerging pests and diseases, and of course, acknowledgement that climate change is a risk multiplier. And despite the risks and the hazards we face, climate adaptation is mentioned only in passing, as is climate resilience. I would suggest the strategy include a section on this. Measures for embedding climate resilience needs spelling out, and a description of what York's climate resilience ambition is needs including. The emphasis on behaviour change is welcomed. The recent IPCC report says there is considerable untapped potential in this area, but that can only really happen through enabling policy and solutions. So these need spelling out. Working together is a phrase that's repeated often in the strategy, but it lacks detail. What's also missing is targeting and working with the big emitters in York, who have the potential to make the biggest impacts in terms of emissions reductions, and also to inspire and demonstrate inspirational leadership in the process. So that's my first point. The second point is around the ambition. I agree with Dave Merritt and Debbie Cobbett. It's very much insufficient ambition. It's not the strategy of a so-called climate leader, which is what the strategy claims that York is. I'm also puzzled by the modelling, and I can't see a reference to, I may have missed it, but the modelling that this is based on. It says that York has elected to follow a high ambition pathway, which is much less ambitious than the science-based targets of the Paris Agreement. And the reason given for this is that apparently the Paris Agreement is not based on tangible policy or implementation. Way to go to diss the Paris Agreement. This high ambition policy is defined as a result of implementation of the targets in the strategy.
You have
like
1 minute left, Kate, just to let you know.
Okay, well, my main point is the strategy says net zero is possible by 2030 based on a 54% reduction and targeting of residual emissions. So residual emissions, that's nearly half residual emissions, and they're not residual. And the 54% reduction against 2019 levels, I don't understand 2019 as a baseline at all. I know that you commissioned a net zero carbon roadmap for York from the University of Leeds, and the difference in that is that it said we could reach 69% if you add them all up carbon reduction by using technically cost-effective, cost-neutral and technically viable measures. So that's more ambitious in itself. The third point is around the removal of residual emissions. The strategy says that these will be removed using nature-based and technological solutions without any information on what these are. So the strategy, that is all the information the strategy contains, for a gap of almost 50% to reach net zero by 2030. And given the importance of closing this gap, we need to know what those measures are. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. And we'll be obviously taking your points into account. My next public speaker is another Kate. Kate Revilius, are you there?
Hello, yes, I'm here. I'm speaking on behalf of York Cycle Campaign about agenda items 4 and 5. The recent IPCC report couldn't have made the need for urgent action clearer. We're here today to make a plea for climate change and transport strategies that support each other, that have clear objectives, and that have carefully considered metrics to assess whether those objectives are being met. When it comes to the citywide transport strategy, the Civic Trust has done much of the legwork for the Council already with their excellent transport strategy, and we hope that the Council are going to adopt many of those targets and metrics that they recommend. It's good to see some progress on the climate change strategy, but this current report leaves us with numerous concerns. The report states that a 33% increase in active travel is needed, but there's no mention of how this increase will be achieved or any acknowledgement that cycling rates have fallen drastically since 2014 by a third. Under the transport heading, the objectives are listed as travel shorter distances, fewer journeys by car, switch to electric vehicles, reduce emissions from freight, and future-proof infrastructure. Arguably, some of these are tools rather than objectives, and there's no mention as to how any of them will be achieved or how they'll be measured. We ask that the report produces a clearer set of objectives and sets out the metrics that can be used to monitor the progress. In the case of transport, we'd anticipate that the primary objective is to eliminate the carbon emissions from transport, and the secondary objectives might be to reduce traffic congestion, improve air quality, improve public health, increase the modal share of active travel, and so on. We'd like to see York learning from other successful councils, such as Hackney Council, who are making big strides in reducing carbon emissions and increasing active travel. Their Homerton low traffic neighbourhood is a good example of a scheme set up with measurable intentions, using clear metrics that enabled the council to rate the success of the scheme. And we'd like to see a similar approach taken on the much delayed active travel schemes in York. It's good to see the council looking for co-benefits, but again we're worried by the data. On page 32 of the Climate Change Strategy Report, it talks about the e-mobility trial and says that e-scooters replaced 16,000 car journeys. Is this based on an observed reduction in traffic on the roads, or is it simply an assumption that every e-scooter journey replaced a car journey? If the latter, then that's not rigorous data, and it certainly can't be translated into a saving of 6 tonnes of carbon dioxide. Finally, speaking from a personal perspective and not on behalf of the Cycle Campaign, I'd like to ask the Scrutiny Committee to help ensure that the Council commits to producing a complete transport strategy before making any major decisions about car parking in the city. Failure to do so will risk the city making decisions that lock in carbon emissions and drastically reduce the chances of York meeting its ambition of being net zero by 2030. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Kate. I will now call Tom Franklin. Are you there, Tom?
I am.
Ah.
Okay.
Yes, you have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for letting me speak. I'm speaking as chair of York Green Party, and I have carefully read the draft climate change strategy that we will be discussing. It's good that we now have a draft, even if it has been a very long time coming. There is much in the report that we should welcome, especially the commitment to significantly reduce emissions within York by all sectors, and going well beyond the council's own emissions. As the council is responsible for less than 4% of the emissions, that is essential. I welcome the work that's been done, for instance, with reducing emissions from housing, construction and zero carbon homes, and the recently announced electric buses. However, the report is simply not ambitious enough. I want to explain two areas where I believe that it needs to be much more ambitious. It does not address reductions in scope 3 emissions, that is emissions elsewhere of products or services that are then consumed within York or by the people of York. This includes things like manufacturing, flights and food production, all major causes of emissions that happen away from York but are used by the people of York. The council needs to address their own scope 3 emissions. Much of these emissions will come from construction, whether house building or road building. The council needs to look at how it will, for instance, move away from steel or concrete to low energy alternatives. I know it's already doing some of this, but needs to do much more. And one major source of emissions would be the Outer Ring Road, which requires significant amounts of steel and concrete and lead to more emissions from cars passing through the edge of York. But, and I know this is difficult, we also need to help the businesses and citizens of York to reduce their scope 3 emissions, something that will require working with them and the government in order to drive real change. The second area that I think needs to be addressed is that even the so-called high ambition does not meet the commitments of the Paris Agreement in order to keep temperature rises below 2 degrees and preferably below 1.5 degrees centigrade. While there is some talk of going beyond this, it is a failure of leadership by the executive member for the environment and climate change to have a high ambition that does not even meet the minimum requirement. And remember that these cuts are only scope 1 and 2 emissions with no plans to cut scope 3 emissions. There is a climate and ecological emergency. We need to do better. If you have been, thanks for listening.
Thank you, Tom. We now move on to our next speaker, Richard Lane. Are you there? Yes. Richard, you too have 3 minutes.
Okay, well. Okay, yes, I'm going to be picking up that one. That one? Yeah, okay. So, yeah, I'm going to be picking up a familiar theme that this strategy is not sufficient. It doesn't go far enough. Yeah, we've heard it doesn't meet the Paris strategy target for 1.5 degrees C. So it's already setting a target that will not give our grandchildren a good chance for decent life, let alone make up for the disproportionately high historic usage of carbon that we have, emissions of carbon, sorry, that we have in the UK, which is what climate justice would demand. And if you'd like to explore that more, then Extinction Rebellion is holding an event on May the 7th called Unheard Voices, which I will circulate details of to you all by email. Okay, so yes, it's not consistent with the 1.5 and the recent IPCC report as well makes it clear we need radical transformative action urgently if we're to have a chance of survival as a civilization. This strategy is not radical. I have every sympathy with the people whose job it is to write this because, yeah, it is the vision that is lacking at the political level. There's very scant political appetite for radical change. We see vision happening elsewhere. It's very frustrating. We see Paris going car-free. We see Hamburg creating a municipal energy store. We see Glasgow building a neighborhood around a zero-carbon water-sourced heat pump network. The strategy shies away from the council's role in that radical change. So if you look at the levels of control and influence diagram, page 9, there's now no acknowledgement of the key responsibility and control that the council has for things like transport, waste and planning. In a climate emergency, this strategy should be driving those policies, not apologetically trying to fit around them. So yeah, we heard about transport already. Yeah, 3% reduction in road transport by 2030. It's pitiful. You know, it's too late for messing around. We need urgent action. Say it like it is. Dueling the ring road in a climate emergency is madness and it needs to be stopped. Right, in my own field is renewable energy. So the targets for renewable energy, 2,356.6 megawatts. Yes, 0.6. So it's very precise. It's great, it's fair enough, but what kind of capacity? You know, 1 megawatt of solar PV will generate 1/10 as much as 1 megawatt of renewable biomass. So yeah, we need targets by technology based on our available resource. That has been modeled extensively. And we need to spell out the steps we need to take. We need better accommodation for retrofit and for solar panels in conservation areas. We need support for wind power in planning policy locally. Of course, for energy storage, there's very few business models for that, but there's things the council can do which aren't really looked at here. Things like requiring houses to have water tanks, hot water tanks, very cheap. That's the cheapest way of energy storage that there is. Make them heat pump ready. One area which the council does seem to be harboring serious ambitions is in setting targets for retrofit. That's great. 29,000 houses getting a deep retrofit by 2030. Why make that about a third of all houses in York? That's amazing. I mean, it might be a typo, but yeah, on the whole, this needs to be strengthened, and I hope there's going to be a chance to do that. But it does say that the modelling has been completed, so it makes me very concerned that there isn't a chance to strengthen this as it needs to be. But I hope you'll be able to. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And our last speaker is Jeff Beacon. Jeff, you also have 3 minutes.
Got to go green. Thank you, Chair. I've been excluded from giving evidence to the local plan. I'm disputing the reasons, but there's a particular piece of research that I think is very interesting that ought to be known by the local plan and also by this committee. It's the work of some people in the Institute of Transport Studies in Leeds. It's a website called carbon.place, and it's calculated that some areas in York have 5 times the amount of emissions as other areas. The other areas being more or less in the city centre, and the 5 times areas outside the outer ring road. And using data from this research, which they do publish, I've done some spreadsheet work and estimated that for every 100k increase in house price, the residents have 2 tonnes a year extra. And if you add a motorist into York, that's 13 tonnes a year extra, which trashes the limit set by Professor Gouldson in his report on the climate emergency for York. Now, given this great difference, we've really got to help the people with these high carbon footprints to cut their emissions. And one way of doing that is to build car-free developments next to them, so that the car-free developments develop car-free facilities, which the high emitters can then use and begin to cut their emissions. As well as that, of course, we ought to tell the high emitters what they're doing, which the council is, I think, would be reluctant to do. But we've got to say, look here, you're doing 18 tonnes a year, and that's just not acceptable. So all new developments in the local plan ought to be car-free, and ideally next to areas that have got high carbon footprints, so they can start to integrate low carbon living into these areas, which at the moment are hooked on cars. You know, there's no way about it. And swapping to electric cars won't do much good, because electric cars have enormous embodied energy and still have emissions from the electricity that they use. So what we've got,
1 minute to go.
What we've got in the local plan are some areas, some plans that will be for high value houses, i.e. wealthier people that will come into York and have high carbon footprints, and will also have cars. And this isn't acceptable, because what we're doing is pushing out the low emitters, the poorer people who can't afford to live in York anymore. And I hope some of you will pass on my disappointment that the local plan inquiry will not take any notice of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you to all our speakers, who are all welcome, and I imagine some of them may be listening remotely now or watching on the webcast. So thank you to you all. So we now move on to our next agenda item, which I think will be presented by Julian Ridge. Is that correct? Julian, welcome, and we look forward to seeing the presentation.
Right, can you all hear me? Well, while the presentation is being set up, I will briefly apologise for the length of this presentation. It became a bit of a monster. It was harder to write a short one than I was hoping, but I hope I can get through it relatively quickly. Of course, can you all hear me now? Good. Okay, so this presentation is about York's emerging local transport strategy. I think it's important to make the point that the local transport strategy happens in a very dynamic environment. Projects and guidance are always coming forward. So at this stage, it's a bit of an emerging picture. I like to think of it as a bit like a jigsaw, but quite a large number of the pieces of this jigsaw are still in a pile at the side of the tray. We are beginning to see what is in the jigsaw, but it is by no means completely obvious yet. So let me see if this works. Right, content. So what I'm going to talk about is these 6 things really. First of all, why am I going to call it a local transport strategy and not the local transport plan? And there's actually quite an important distinction there. I'll talk a little bit about the trends that we've seen both nationally and in York and what they mean for our emerging local transport strategy. I'll talk about our own emerging policies, particularly the carbon reduction policy that we're talking about this evening. I will talk about national policies and devolution because they are actually quite important in what we do. I'll set out what I think is emerging as the framework and the kind of areas that we'll be working on in the local transport strategy. And finally, I'll set out our next steps and the timescales for how we will continue to deliver this document. So, why am I calling it a local transport strategy and not a local transport plan? Well, for those of you who might be familiar with the history or not familiar, the local transport plan is a statutory document. It's been a statutory document since 1999. Local transport plan actually means something. It means a prescribed document that's set out to a series of protocols set out by the Department of Transport and to their timescales and using their modelling methodologies, etc., etc. We're waiting for some new guidance from the Department of Transport. We are expecting to get that in the next month or so. And obviously we will use that to write a local transport plan. But until we have that guidance, we can't call what we are writing a local transport plan. So we'll call it a local transport strategy. It will undoubtedly set out what we're looking to achieve in our local transport plan, but because it won't have all the components which are required for a local transport plan, we will not be able to call it a local transport plan. So it's a bit of a health warning, and it might seem like semantics, but actually it's quite an important distinction to make. So York, a bit of a stock take as all the pieces are falling into place. Well, first of all, our local transport strategy is written in a very dynamic environment. There are all kinds of trends going on with transport. Some of them are related to things like COVID and COVID recovery. Others are just general churn and trend and change in the transport use and network in York. And there are some new things like the bus service improvement plan that we were given an indicative funding award for last week. So everything changes around the local transport plan, and we have to. That's always true. Whenever you write a transport plan, that's the case. So you have to work within that constraint, and that's something that you have to be very aware of. So the kind of things going on, we've got trends, we've got ongoing projects like station frontage in York Central. We've got the local plan examination. When that is complete, there will undoubtedly be some comments and recommendations about transport related to that. We have the carbon and economic strategies that the carbon one we're talking about later, and the economic strategy and health strategy are separate things, but they all inform our transport strategy, because transport is an enabler of other strategies rather than something itself. We have central government initiatives, policy and guidance. That's perhaps particularly important at the moment, because at the moment central government seems to be maybe more hands-on about the detail of local transport planning than it has been certainly at any time during my career. So certainly some of the stuff about active transport projects and the bus service improvement plans have been accompanied by a level of central government interest in what we're doing at a local level that I've never seen before. There is obviously the devolution agenda, which in transport terms means, will the local transport plan sit with City of York Council, or will it be with the combined authority at a higher level? And if it is with the combined authority, what does that mean for how we make policy for York? So generally, we can't stop the clock whilst we work out what to do next. So we need to measure how we're doing with things. We need to evaluate, collect data. We need to be flexible, and we need to be prepared to adapt whatever plans we come up with. So I'll talk a little bit about trends, projects and forecasts. I love data, so this is my favourite bit. So some national trends, first of all, which are actually quite surprising and unintuitive if you haven't seen them before. So since the mid-1990s, we've seen about a 20% reduction in the number of commute trips per week. So the amount of commuting that's taking place is falling. Some of that, this data is all from 2018, so it's pre-COVID. So even before COVID, we were seeing quite a substantial reduction in AM and PM peaks. If you look at individual age groups, it becomes even more differentiated. So 18 to 30-year-old males now travel 50% fewer miles than they did in 1995. A lot of that is to do with people adopting habits of car ownership and car use much later in their lives. So in the 1990s, 80% of people were driving by the age of 30. By 2018, 80% of people were driving by the age of 45. There are some really substantial societal changes going on here. In the 1980s, we saw traffic grow by 50% in 10 years, whereas in the decade to 2016, it only grew by 2%. These are really big changes. And overall, if you look at the total number of trips taking place in the UK, now there are 16% fewer of them in 1996. Now than there were in 2018, in fact, pre-COVID, than there were in 1996. So what does that mean for York? So this is a graph of the number of vehicles crossing the city centre bridges. So Ouse Bridge, Skeldergate Bridge and Lendal Bridge. It starts in 1965 and it runs until 2020. And obviously this is a data set we collect every year. It's a slightly false graph in a way because it doesn't start at zero. But what you can see is that the amount of traffic immediately pre-COVID was about 2/3 of the amount that you would see crossing those bridges in the 60s and 70s. That is a big change. And it confounds ideas that traffic just goes up and up and up in the centre of York. It doesn't, we've lost 1/3 of it. But that's not true everywhere in York. These two graphs talk about the A64 and the A1237, so the two orbital routes. And actually in those routes, we are seeing increases. These are since 1991, so it's a slightly different comparison. But you can see that there is a movement away from the city centre and towards the orbital routes. Have we seen movements to other modes? Well, this is the number of bus users in York from 1999 to the present. And actually, we've seen the number of bus trips in New York increase by 2/3 over that period. That's actually quite... Councillor Melly?
Is that adjusted for population growth? Is that kind of total numbers or like a per capita number?
That number is the number of people carried on the York bus network over that period, and it's all for the City of York council area. So some of it is underlying growth in the population, but the population has not grown by 66% in York over that period. It's grown by, I can't remember off the top of my head, 25% or something, considerably less. And I know from experience that lots of that growth is actually on the local bus network rather than the park and ride network. So there is, you know, over the long term, there is significant transfer to other modes. I don't have equivalent numbers to hand for walk and cycle trips, and I'd be very interested in seeing them, and we will be doing some research as part of the LTP over what they are. It's useful to say a little bit about COVID, because COVID is seen as a bit of a watershed in the way that people make trips. I actually think the jury is still out about whether it is a watershed or whether, you know, it is a short-term interruption after which things would go back to something that looks more like normal. But in terms of COVID, we saw an absolutely enormous reduction in trip making between March 2020 and June 2020. And I can remember looking at the bus network, and we lost 97% of our passengers in some weeks compared to the previous year. But as of now, and now in the context of this presentation, was actually about 3 or 4 months ago, because some of these slides are from a different presentation that I wrote then. But at that point, local roads were seeing about 95% of the traffic that they'd seen pre-COVID. On the strategic road networks, the A64, it's about 103%. Buses were 85%. I think they're now about 90%. Rail was 70%. It's probably a bit more now. Active modes, it's actually quite difficult to count. We count the number of pedestrians and cyclists in places where we have counters, but they're concentrated in the city centre. So people who are trading a city centre commute trip for a leisure trip that might be out into one of the rural areas around York wouldn't be counted. We do need to do some work trying to nail down exactly what the trends for active modes are. The morning peak was considerably less than it was pre-COVID. The PM peak is a bit more or similar. Midweek days, traditionally the busiest days are Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday, but they tend to look a bit more like Fridays and Mondays before COVID. So it's a kind of incremental change. When we do traffic modelling, it always seems to end up looking like something like 2019 in the short term. So I think my conclusion about that is COVID has undoubtedly changed things, but I think the idea that it is an absolute game changer for the longer term, I'm not sure how sustainable that view will be. We've got a whole bunch of projects in York as well. These will influence how travel takes place. So we've got rebuilding the station frontage, York Central coming on stream, Castle Gateway. We've got a whole load of active travel schemes and cycle schemes on various corridors and pedestrian schemes. We've won £8.5 million to convert 44 of our buses to electric power from diesel. So there's a lot going on. We've also got the outer ring road dualling from the A19 north to Hopgrove, and we've got a whole bunch of schemes in the pipeline which will also influence things. When I wrote this first bus service improvement plan was in pipeline. We've now been awarded £17.5 million to implement that for the next 3 years. There is a project to dual the remaining section of the outer ring road. Haxby Station is progressing. National Highways themselves have got a project to dual or improve the A64 from the Hopgrove roundabout to Barton Hill, which is the dual carriageway section on the way to Moulton. And there are lots of rail enhancements to improve frequencies on the Harrogate line and the Scarborough line, and improve frequencies to Leeds, to London, etc., etc. What's all this look like on the local traffic network? Well, this is part of our modelling output. What you tend to see there is a continuation of the existing trends. You get more traffic on the orbital routes. You don't see, sorry, the red lines indicate growing traffic. You don't tend to see that level of growth on the corridors within the city centre. Some of those orange blobs are indicating increased waiting time at junctions, though. So there is some increased travel times on some of the radials in the city forecast for 2033 compared to the 2019 base that we use for making our assessments. So conclusions from that, well, transport plans are formulated in very dynamic environments. Things are changing all the time. There is clearly a long-term trend away from car use, especially in urban environments, and that's something that we need to look to capitalise on. We are seeing increasing vehicle trips on the orbital routes. Now there's a question that obviously in terms of congestion, that's perhaps a good thing, but in terms of carbon reduction, it's not such a good thing. We are seeing increasing use in York of non-car modes, especially bus, but I suspect cycling and walking, although we need to do quite a bit of research into the numbers to demonstrate whether that's the case or not. We have quite a large suite of projects which are either actively being delivered at the moment or are in a pipeline to be delivered in the near future. And the last map I showed you shows that these can accommodate some growth on the non-car modes, but there is nonetheless some traffic growth within the city. So, policy environment. We have a whole series of policies. They continue to be valid, even though we're updating our local transport plan. So local transport plan 3 is nominally valid until 2035, so it's valid at the moment. Much of it was reviewed by the Civic Trust, and they concluded that much of it was still appropriate, although many of the original projects that we were seeking to get money for, which things like York Central, were now complete. The local plan itself, that actually has a very large influence on transport in York, because it predicates 20% population growth to 2033, a lot of which is on the urban edge, brownfield sites, and there are 1 or 2 fairly substantial standalone developments outside the ring road. That will have a big influence on transport, and it's fixed in the sense that we've published the local plan and we're now heading to examination. As Sean will say later, the carbon strategy is very important. We've got a 71% reduction in the carbon strategy for transport, a reduction in car mileage, transfer to other modes, electrification of the vehicle fleet. But I think there's a very important implication about the carbon strategy, which is previously when we've looked at transport strategy and behavioural change, it's always been about reducing congestion, which means that it's been focused on the place where congestion takes place, which is the city centre. But carbon reduction, actually, you want to reduce carbon emissions from transport everywhere. So that forces you to take a much more general approach to transport across York, rather than the more focused one on the places where problems are presenting in terms of congestion. And that is a very important distinction. Another important implication of the carbon strategy is actually as climate changes and there are more extreme weather events, that itself imposes quite a lot of impacts on the transport network itself, which has to become much more resilient to things like flooding, high rainfall events, high winds, et cetera. And actually the costs of improving drainage networks and highways to accommodate that are not insubstantial. And I think finally there is the economic strategy, which is emerging at the moment, but it's pretty clear from discussing with that department of the council that there's an appreciation that shortcomings with transport are currently shutting some off from economic opportunity. National policy, obviously in terms of carbon, we're expecting detailed local transport planning guidance quite shortly. There's a suggestion that that will actually include some quantified carbon reduction targets, and I suspect there'll be some modelling software that comes with it. I was slightly taken aback a couple of weeks ago that the DfT made a grant to all local authorities to help them prepare their local transport plans, which was something that they made in advance of releasing the guidance, but it suggests that there'll be some fairly substantial duties placed on local authorities to comply with the guidance when it comes out. Again, as I said just now, I mean, we've got the national bus strategy and gear change, which is about walking and cycling. It's a level of, I would say, micromanagement of local authority schemes that I've never seen before. So, we are told, what we can and what we can't do, And there is a question about whether the DfT might step in to try and shape schemes at a local level, which is something we've never previously had to consider. The levelling up agenda has some really big transport implications. There's a specific objective within the levelling up agenda for a London-style public transport network. That has implications in terms of ticketing, buses, bus services, frequencies, etc., etc. But also, I think more generally, we are in the north, but we are less deprived than many local transport authorities in the north, some of which are adjacent to York. So there's a big question about, to what extent York plays into the levelling up agenda, and is York for an engine for more regional growth, and what does that mean in terms of transport? And finally, there's a devolution agenda. So where does the local transport plan sit within the new combined authority? Is it at the City of York Council level? Is it at the combined authority level? If it's at the combined authority level, how is that going to work? These are all things that we're trying to get our heads around at the moment. So the implications of all this, well, I think in terms of carbon reduction policies, we've been following policies in York for about 35 years, which are roughly aligned with what the DfT are requiring us to do now. And I think that's quite important. We've got a lot of embedded knowledge in how to do this stuff that a lot of other local authorities don't have. At the moment, we're waiting for the DfT guidance, and there's obviously a gap while we wait for that. When we receive that guidance, it will tell us what we're required to do for the LTP, but also critically, the LTP, first and foremost, is a funding document. That guidance will tell us what we need to do in order to attract funding to enact schemes in York. Carbon and levelling up, transport will be more closely aligned to non-transport outcomes around climate change and economics, and also health. So, we need to think about how transport is very clearly aligned to this. The LTP will no longer just be about how you make the transport system work and how you reduce congestion. It's how it plugs into all of these other things. And finally, when we come to devolution and the way the DfT is quite hands-on these days, there's a bit of a question about how much freedom of movement we will actually have in practice. If a lot of what local authorities are expected to do is set out very clearly in some detail, we might find we have relatively little freedom for movement in our policy making. So in terms of our new transport strategy, what does this actually mean? Well, I've been thinking generally about what kind of themes are going to emerge. And I think we have six themes that we'll concentrate on. And this is at a very, very early stage. So these are very, very initial thoughts about what are required. And obviously we'll be doing a lot of consultation on these to ensure that people are comfortable with what we're saying. So first of all, our strategies there'll be something about delivery and how we get projects done. There'll be something about opportunity, how transport is used to improve people's opportunities. Carbon reduction will obviously be an enormous element of the local transport strategy, probably the biggest element. Health and well-being will be important, supporting growth. Growth of York as a city will be important. And finally, I think we will need to set out how we're going to look after flexibility and how our plans will be adaptable. It will no longer be acceptable, I suspect, to set out a local transport strategy and then follow it without necessarily monitoring too closely about what its impacts are for 5 years and then completely revising it. So we'll need to be quite dynamic about how we do monitoring and evaluation. If people are happy, I can say a little bit more about each of these strategies. I'm aware that I've taken a little while so far.
If we can speed it up a little bit during that.
Okay, well, I'll bash through these as quickly as possible. So what do these actually mean? Well, delivery, it's all about existing projects. Can we deliver things on time and on budget? Can we integrate our new projects with our existing infrastructure and take most advantage of that? Can we maintain what we already have and what we put in? There'll be quite a lot about how we develop new schemes, our pipeline of schemes, and how we do that with the more prescriptive approach that DfT is likely to want. There will be quite a lot about how we seek out bidding opportunities in what I call a decentralised funding environment. So it used to be the case that if you wanted transport funding, you wrote a major schemes bid for the Department of Transport and they told you whether they were going to fund it or not. But now we've got, it's decentralised. You know, we've got devolution funding, combined authority, levelling up funds, you know, about half a dozen different public transport funds that we apply for. It is a very, very decentralised environment for attracting funding now, and that has implications for how local authorities do that. And we're also going to have to link whatever projects we have to the local plan and the development allocations within that. In terms of opportunity, I think this is going to be about how transport is an enabler of access to opportunity, particularly, I think, setting out how we make York a city where your opportunity is not affected by whether you have a car or not. So you can get everywhere that you need to, and you can access all the opportunities that you need to access without car ownership being required. As I said earlier, there's probably some implications about access to York from more deprived areas of the region. So it won't just be about local links. There are obviously questions about gender and identity and how people's gender and identity might prevent them from using certain types of transport and how we overcome that. And also how we overcome accessibility issues for people who are mobility or sensorily impaired, how we design our systems so that those impairments do not prevent access to opportunity. Carbon is probably the most important part. The strategy itself has got a 71% reduction in carbon by 2030, and the LTP guidance is likely to ask for quantified carbon reductions. Obviously, the way that we do that, we develop alternatives to car travel, so walk, cycle and public transport. We try and change the way that people travel around, so there's a reduction in driving, so there are more shorter trips, replacing longer trips, and there's obviously an implication for people accessing more of the things that they want to access locally. That's often called things like the 15-minute city or the 20-minute city. But you could see how you could make something like that in York work by developing some of the local centres, including, of course, the city centre, which is the local centre for large numbers of people living within 10-15 minutes walk of the city centre. The question really about this is not whether you do it or not, because the government's going to require us to do it, but how hard do you go in York? And I think it's critical that, you know, you can make change, but you need to be able to take people with you to make progress. You have to get the right balance between change you can make and the change people are willing to make themselves. More carbon, well, there's moving away from the car as another part of the carbon strategy. 25% reduction in car mileage and a 3% reduction in trips. There are a number of things we can do to bring that about. We can change the parking supply and the pricing. We can redesignate some of our streets, so you can have more streets for place, as it were, streets where people move around, and identify streets that are specifically for vehicle movements. You can make changes to traffic signals to encourage certain types of transport behaviour. You can use modal filters, which prevent certain types of transport access in certain places. And you can provide support for people giving up cars. So things like scrappage schemes where, you know, if you give up your car, you are given a bike and or public transport tickets. We can seek to minimise the impact of the vehicle use, which does take place. A large part of the strategy is electrifying the vehicle fleet, and there's an assumption that 90% of it will be electrified by 2030. We can reduce the need of people to own a car by investigating car shares, taxi, private hires. We can look at trip interception. We already do a lot of that with park and ride, but there's potential to do that with freight. We can look at orbital routes which don't go through the city centre, and obviously there's a particular link here. If we can push traffic onto orbital routes, it makes it easier to achieve traffic reductions in the city centre. Big part of York is green tourism, so we can encourage people to access York by rail, bus, cycle, walk, coach, and we can make changes to parking strategy and enforcement. Final part of carbon is obviously related to health and well-being, because it is related to active modes. The strategy has a 33% increase in walking and cycling, 25% increase in bus trips include walk trips to the stops. These are quite challenging targets, and they'll have implications in terms of the networks that we'll have to deliver in order to reach those targets. Transport safety, making people feel safe as they move around. Active modes are an important part of that. Supporting growth, obviously that's all about the new developments. They've got to be planned with sustainable travel at their hearts. They've got to be near existing walking, cycling and public transport networks. Many of them are already very near to things like park and ride sites. Where the developments are new, we'll have to put those networks in. They will have to be attractive so that people use them. And we will have to, crucially, raise the funding to do that. In some cases, those networks will be quite expensive to provide. We already have modal targets for many of the new developments, which are quite ambitious. We'll have to find a way of enshrining them. Final thing, adaptability and flexibility. This is about how we actually manage the plan. We'll put the plan in place, but we will have to collect a lot of data to make sure it's working probably more intensively than we ever have done before. And this will have to look at some of the wider outcomes of transport, so things like air quality. It won't just be measuring levels of congestion and number of trips on different modes, and we will have to be able to change course if the targets are not being met. So that kind of rattles through what I was going to say. I don't know whether it's appropriate now to take short. I will apologise again for the length of the presentation. I don't normally make them as long as that, but this particular one, I couldn't find a way of shortening it.
Thank you, Julian. And my first take would just draw the attention of the committee to something that was contained within all of that, that there's an assumption that by 2023, the population will have grown 20%. So we can sort of understand that we'll have to reduce carbon emissions by 20% by 2033 just to stay still. And then we're adding a 71% reduction on top of that. So I just want everyone to be aware of the enormity of what it is we're talking about in a context where national figures show that carbon emissions from transport have barely changed since 1990. All the benefits that have come from the difference in the way people behave, the efficiency of the combustion engine and everything else has been cancelled out by population growth, as I understand it. And I don't think York's any different to anywhere else. And certainly the figures we saw some 2 years ago when the committee was looking at that suggested that transport had barely shifted in the past 20 years. So, and now just like to invite members to make comments on what they've seen and where you think we are with this. Are we moving forward effectively? Are we missing the opportunity to do things? Should we be waiting for a local transport plan to develop a strategy? What do you think? Councillor Fenton, yes.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm just trying to understand, obviously the local transport plan, we're waiting for DfT guidance, and obviously we don't want to do anything that would stymie our chances with any bids to DfT. And I don't have a problem with a strategy informing a plan. That seems the right way around to do it. I'm just trying to think of the sequencing, and do you envisage the two being worked up in parallel, or is the strategy something you want to kind of get out there for to get some exposure and comments whilst developing the plan in anticipation of DfT telling us that yes, we're on the right tracks? It'd be helpful to have some information about the sort of choreography of how these things fit together.
Okay, well there was a secret slide in the slide pack Oh, which is gone. Right. So the way I see resolving it is this. We're waiting for the LTP guidance. I am expecting to get that any day now, but I've been expecting that for about 6 months. But I think there's nothing to stop us progressing our local transport strategy without the guidance, because I think what we are likely to do in York is likely to be roughly in line with the guidance. We might have to change it a little bit, but I'm not expecting the guidance to vary very much from what a York local transport strategy would look like. So I think what we do is we develop the strategy. The strategy becomes a very important input to the local transport plan. And in fact, the strategy might be the sort of overarching strategy document, because the LTP will contain things like, you know, statements about how we maintain the highway network. And so if we assume that, then we can do our big conversation data collection in the next couple of months. We can produce a general statement of principles for some consultation later in the summer, and we can actually produce a sort of more formal, you know, document in the autumn, which hopefully, assuming we haven't completely failed to second guess what will be in the LTP guidance, would be suitable for incorporation within the LTP in the autumn.
Thank you. I'll make a comment, and hopefully other members will have had time to think of things. I have to say, I'm appalled at how long this process is taking. I see that we go over and over the analysis of the current situation, and we're very good at that. We have a very good understanding of where we are. I think we have a pretty good understanding of the mobility challenges that we face, though I think we're all aware that different groups in the city would question whether we address all those mobility challenges. I think we're beginning to get some sense of the targets, though they're extraordinarily difficult. What it seems to me is continuously lacking in this process is a clear vision. And I'd like your thoughts as to how you see that being assembled. And I put that in the context of last April, a year ago from now, the all-party transport working group agreed that it would be a good idea to have case studies of 9 cities that were clear examples of best practice, for those to be worked up and presented to feed into the creation of a vision for the future for York. My understanding is that the case studies were agreed with the Civic Trust. The Civic Trust, they were agreed with officers, I think with yourself, Julian. They were produced and delivered at the beginning of September last year, and nothing has happened since. And what worries me hugely is, why are we falling down on the vision? Why do we appear to be falling down on the vision? How do we unlock it? How do we get the will of council, which we've heard expressed many times from March 2019 and the declaration of a climate emergency, to all the other motions that have come forwards? How do we transform that political will that is cross-party in this city into the production of vision documents that can move this process forwards? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think, I mean, in a way, this seems a very bizarre thing for someone who's a transport planner to say, but I wouldn't want to overplay the importance of transport in this. And transport's just a derived demand. Nobody travels for the sake of traveling. Well, some people do, but very few trips are undertaken by people who travel for the sake of traveling. So your vision, it has to come from elsewhere. It's, you know, what you do with your transport network, it's to serve your carbon strategy and your economic strategy and your health strategy. I mean, I would be very happy to come up with a vision for York, like a sort of 1-to-1 scale train set, but actually that wouldn't help anyone. It might reduce traffic congestion, it might reduce traffic queues, but the true vision has to come from integration with other policies.
Thank you. So am I right in understanding, in a sense, what you're saying is that transport is just an expression of the mobility needs of the population, and it's what people want to do, where they want to do it, what opportunities they have, the economic framework, the carbon reduction framework, that is the driver for what actually is just discussions about particular boxes with particular kinds of wheels?
Yeah, pretty much.
Thank you.
Depressing,
Okay.
but.
Thank you. Yes, Councillor Melly.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for Julian for coming in, talking to us and putting together so much information in a presentation. I think it would have been helpful if it had been in a report and been published publicly, at least a week ahead, so members of the public would have had access to it, we would have had access to it. I think that also would have helped with what you were saying about bringing people along with us. Just having it all following the normal committee processes, I think, helps with that. And also, I think some things to do with wording can help with bring people along as well. So, for example, in your presentation, you described some people as having impairments. Well, actually, I think it's helpful to acknowledge that people are impaired by a transport system that, a public speaker described it as, they said they felt they'd been designed out of the transport system. And I think for a long time, that's been the case, where we've had a transport system that really disadvantages, well, especially women and disabled people, but also people of colour, LGBTQ people. And it's not a matter of people having impairments, it's a matter of people being impaired by a transport system that doesn't work for them. So I think sometimes maybe just tweaking the wording a little would help to bring people along with us a bit as well. But I'm going to try and stick to positives. I'm really glad to finally see not just vague targets like, increasing bus use by 25%, increasing active travel by 33%, but some actual specific ideas. You mentioned some to do with like parking supply and cost and bus gates, and you had quite a long list of proposals. I didn't see anything on demand responsive transport or much on climate change mitigation. I'd be interested to know if there's things, like quite big things that we're going to have to change, like road surfaces and that sort of thing. I think there's been some trials of, is it kind of like rubberized road surfaces or something, and whether they're deal better if we have with temperature changes and that sort of thing. And and I'm also disappointed with how long this transport strategy is taking, and it means that big projects, you mentioned some like York Outer Ring Road and Station Frontage and York Central, that we're having a strategy that's being designed with them kind of being assumed as done and finished, rather than those big projects with huge transport implications being designed to fit with a strategy. And the longer, having a transport strategy and a transport plan in place, the longer it takes, the more we're building in car dependency and that sort of thing. So those are just my thoughts to start off with. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Mary. Councillor Barnes, yes.
Thanks, Chair.
Sorry, did you want to feed back to sorry, I should have.
I'm happy to. I suppose what to say in terms of the measures, the stuff that's in that presentation is not a complete list by any means, and there are all kinds of things that I missed out to try and stop it being even longer than it was. But there are lots of measures that we will look into, and when we produce the final document, we'll need to consider all of those. I think another point is it's not the case. When at the moment, it's not the case that we don't have a transport strategy. We do have a transport strategy. It's LTP3, and it has been looked at, and the Civic Trust thought that generally it was fit for use, and actually a lot of the next local transport plan will probably be quite similar to it. So that is always guiding what we're doing, and it is seeking to reduce things like car ownership and car use anyway.
Thank you. Yes, Councillor Barnes.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. It's necessarily complex, and I appreciate that. I want to focus in on the sort of carbon strand, which you've identified as probably the most important. And there's one of the comments in there that sort of, to me at least, rings slight alarm bells, which is under carbon 1, the final bullet there. You need to take people with you to make progress. Of course you do. Some people, but you can't please all of the people all of the time. And transformation, by its nature, should be uncomfortable and will create winners and losers. So I guess, you know, the converse to that is, you know, you've got to crack a few eggs to make an omelette, haven't you? So I'm just curious, and let's look at it through the lens of, I don't know, parking, which you've identified as one of the things that you'd need to look at, you know, parking strategy and enforcement. So I guess, you know, my question is to you, do you feel empowered as a transport planner to be able to break some eggs in order to make the omelette? Do you think the level of ambition is there? And then that's one of my questions. The second is, I think we have got evidence that we're taking people with us insofar as the support is there publicly, politically, cross-party for decarbonisation, and transport is a key part of that. I think where it falls down probably is that people are not empowered to join the dots. And I wonder, therefore, it would be really good to see in the transport strategy and the subsequent plan a joining of the dots, so that if we're talking about having to reduce supply of parking or increase the cost of parking, or both, I guess, rather than that being taken as an issue in isolation and people, you know, the reactionary sentiment and people going mad, actually connecting that to the transport, to the city's decarbonisation ambitions, and almost saying, you know, if you want to achieve your low ambition 54% decarbonisation target, this is what we need to do in terms of transport plan. If you want to achieve Paris, this is what we need to do, so that people can see, you know, this is not an attack on car drivers. This is all linked to a strategic direction of travel for which we know there is widespread public and political support.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's quite right. I mean, I think the interesting thing about the transport plan is that the bits that there are two, I suppose you can think of it as sort of three parts of the local transport plan. So there is writing the document, then there is bringing people with you to support what is written in the document, and then there is attracting the funding to do the things that you are setting out to achieve. And I think actually the second two of those things, writing the document is the easy bit. So I think you're quite right to highlight that.
And to my question, do you feel there is do you feel empowered as a transport planner to be able to, you know, break some eggs to make the omelette? Do you think the willingness to take risk is there and to do those things?
Well, I think CYC is certainly committed to achieving the carbon strategy. I think we are doing some quite ambitious things. I think there's targets in the local plan which are quite ambitious. Obviously the bus service improvement plan that we've recently got funding for is quite ambitious. The same is true of the zero emission bus fund that we tapped into a couple of weeks ago. So yeah, I think certainly, and also the various active travel projects that we've got on. So I think, yes, there is certainly ambition and willingness to look hard at what can be achieved.
Just one final question, if I may. The examples you've cited there are all examples really of positive enhancements that have by and large been funded by external funding opportunity, and, you know, rightly we take those opportunities. Can you give us examples of things which have maybe been difficult and have involved, you know, breaking eggs rather than positive enhancements?
Well, I'd like to think that even the things that have some costs to people are still positive enhancements when they're considered in the round. I mean, there have been a number of things that we've done which have been quite controversial. I mean, an example of that would be the Groves low traffic neighbourhood. So yes, there's been a desire to look at things, even accepting that, you know, they will not be popular with everyone.
Yes, just before I bring you in to finish a point that Councillor Barnes has made there. You've been talking about breaking eggs there, Councillor Barnes, and it occurs to me to ask, you showed us a big list of projects that we're involved with. Are we actually measuring the carbon cost or benefit of all of those? Do we know what they're contributing towards the solution that we're trying to develop in our strategy? Because I've yet to see the indication that we're quantifying stuff in order to be able to apply ourselves to the scale of the challenge we face, and to look at, you know, a change in a junction or whatever it is that you were showing us back there, and identify what does this contribute to our challenge? Do we have that data?
I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, for the big projects, we are required to do it. So, for instance, for the Outer Ring Road, for York Central and the station frontage, they are funded through a methodology which is controlled by West Yorkshire Combined Authority. They have a really detailed carbon calculator that you use for those projects. Some of the projects are being done, you know, largely to save carbon. So the zero emission bus project, actually the calculation of the carbon savings, which I was amazed by how much there were, to be honest, were, you know, that was a key part of the funding metric, and we wouldn't have got the money if the carbon savings had not been as large as they were, because, you know, that was part of the cost benefits appraisal. The DFT has a methodology for pricing carbon. So for every ton you remove from the atmosphere, there is a value to that. And that was a large part of the benefits of the project. So for large projects, it is, you know, it is calculated. For the smaller projects, like, you know, if we make changes to a junction or something like that, I think that data will be quite difficult to capture. It's not necessarily the same thing as saying we shouldn't do it, but you know, it's not always easy to make these calculations. The local transport plan guidance that I'm expecting to get any day now is supposed to have a methodology in it for quantifying carbon reduction. Now, I don't know quite how the DFT are going to do this, but my sort of working assumption is that there will be some kind of spreadsheet calculator, or possibly even a piece of modelling software, which we will need to use to appraise whatever strategy we put in. And because of the way that government seems to be increasingly hands-on in local transport planning, it will be interesting to see whether our ability to attract funding to do the interventions which are in the plan will be, you know, proportionate to our ability for those interventions to reduce carbon.
And sorry, Councillor Periton, just to finish this off. So you've said that, yes, we do a calculation on the potential carbon benefit as part of an application for a project to get something done. Are we actually measuring, after we've done a project, is this delivering what we said it would?
Well, I mean, the projects that I spoke about, none of them have been completed. So we can't, right, at this stage, we don't know what the impacts of them because they're not finished. But I mean, major transport projects have a detailed 1, 3 and 5 year monitoring and evaluation methodology, and carbon costs are part of that. And I think increasingly they consider not only the transport carbon impacts, but also things like construction costs.
Okay. And I ask, obviously, because if we don't measure what we've done after we've done it, we've got no real idea what we're achieving. We need to be able to demonstrate that. Sorry, Councillor Perrott, sorry to kind of delay you there.
That's okay, thanks, Chair. So I was interested when you'd said about sort of not really necessarily having the overarching vision, but it being more about enabling sort of the vision that was in other strategies. So I suppose my question's more about how involved you get and at what stage in the process, because you did mention about potentially consulting about your initial themes and sort of seeing how they fit in. So how involved are you with sort of the development of strategy elsewhere, if then your job is to sort of enable what is possible and what we think is achievable within those strategies?
Oh, quite involved. I mean, I've been quite involved with the carbon strategy, for example. I'm quite involved with the local plan at the moment. You know, the health and well-being strategy and the economic strategy as they emerge, you know, are also things that I'll be involved with. So yeah, I mean, it is all joined up.
If I could just follow up as well about the consultation point, just because obviously we're going to be discussing sort of next steps for the climate strategy, which I think is going to have a recommendation to go out to consult again. If you're doing consultation sort of on your themes, will it be taking into account sort of the strategy as it is live? Sort of how does that work? Do you sort of just, obviously everything's in play at the minute, isn't it, for you? So it's quite hard to say sort of for your strategy at what point things might be nailed down, but you did mention potentially consulting on your initial themes. So will that be done in tandem? Is that going to happen after?
Yeah, it's all being done as part of our big conversation. So it will all be done, you know, as a single consultation. And in fact, I mean, we've been talking about questions and how we're going to structure focus groups and things like that. And I think it's probably fair to say that people who take part in the consultation, they won't necessarily know that they're being consulted specifically about climate change or transport or the economy. It'll be much more about, you know, how these things interrelate. And
Councillor Melly, yes.
Thanks. Sort of related to that, do you know when there'll be an access officer in post to input into the strategy?
Sorry, could you?
Do you know when there'll be an access officer in post who'll be able to input into the strategy?
That's not, I'm afraid that's not something that I'm involved with personally. So. I can find out.
Thanks, Chair. If I may, just return to this question of the parking strategy and supply. One of my concerns is that with, you know, this is one of many examples where I think local authorities are probably not really empowered or very good at costing externalities. And I think, you know, that's a clear example of somewhere that you're going to have if you look to restrict parking supply, for example, you're going to see, or it would lead to a reduction in revenue. And that's very easy to forecast. What's less easy, I guess, is comparing that with the benefit that would be gained in terms of reduction in carbon emissions, improved walking and cycling rates and so on. So I just wondered if we look at that as an example, is there a methodology in place to be able to robustly do that? And if so, what would be the nominal price per tonne of carbon that you would apply to that decision-making process?
Well, I'll answer the first one. I should know this because I'm an economist by background, but I mean, I should know what the nominal price that's applied to a tonne of carbon is, but I can find out. In terms of how we actually monitor or in terms of how we actually analyse different strategies, I mean, we have, in York, we have a 4-stage transport model. I don't know if you remember the map I showed that had the lines and the blobs on it, which is an output of that model. That can be used, that model will forecast how trip making changes in relation to, you know, something like a change in parking price, or, you know, change to the highway, or what, you know, what roads you can use in the city centre or whatever, or a reduction in the bus fare. So we would use that, and there is part of that outputs the number of vehicle kilometres on the network, and obviously you can change the number of vehicle kilometres, you can convert the number of vehicle kilometres into a carbon emissions figure. So we do have a variety of tools to do it, but you know, the main one that we would use is that 4-stage model.
Maybe I can bring in Sean, if you could introduce yourself as well, and then.
Certainly, Chair. Sean Gibbons, Head of Carbon Reduction. Councillor Barnes, the HM Treasury Green Book provided some supplementary guidance in 2020 about how to value carbon in major projects. So if we used that approach, that would allow us to factor in those externalities.
And then if I may, thank you, Sean. I guess ultimately, though, someone has to make that political decision, don't they? If you're going to close a car park and reduce revenue. And I just wonder, you know, there are good examples of companies who go beyond legal requirement and introduce internal carbon pricing as a measure. And they sit that within a clearly stated ESG strategy. And they say that we are going to take nominal carbon costing into account. And like you say, you could use the model and then apply and then combine that with the Green Book methodology to have your carbon costing. Ultimately, the decision has to be made though. And the council doesn't accrue any direct financial benefit from closing a car park, but it does accrue potential externality benefit, which is good for people and society and so on and so forth. So I guess ultimately where I'm going is, you know, if we're going to make the right decisions rather than the short-term, you know, financially prudent decisions for council coffers, my view is transport planning would need to adopt some kind of a voluntary, for the time being, until central government legislates, strategic position where we say we are going to truly cost these externalities. I just wonder, is that a conversation that's even, are we just a million miles away from that in terms of political realities, or is there something that goes some way towards it?
I think it'll be very interesting to see to what extent carbon externalities are part of the next set of local transport planning guidance when it comes out. This is the funding bid that we used for the zero emission bus bid. And I was just looking through that to see what values of carbon were used, actually, because they were the Green Book measures that Sean referred to. So yeah, I mean, these are all things that we can potentially evaluate. You know, I suppose like any cost benefit appraisal, there are large numbers of components of it. And I think the other thing is it's not just carbon. I mean, there are other externalities of vehicle use, you know, including things like, you know, additional costs maintaining the highway network, accident costs. If it costs congestion, there are significant vehicle travel time costs, unreliability costs. So you need to consider everything in the round, I think, really, to produce a piece of robust analysis.
One final one, yes, because we've got a lot to get through.
Can you envisage a scenario where we take it upon ourselves to put a system in place that recognises these externalities, or do you think we'll just sit around and wait for government to issue guidance or legislation?
Yes. Yeah. And you're speaking for the first time, Claire, as well, so if you can introduce yourself.
Sorry, yes, we all wanted to come in then, sorry. So Claire Fowles, Assistant Director of Policy and Strategy. So one of my roles is making sure that all of our strategies align, that they that we can demonstrate and understand the co-benefits and the co-interdependencies between particularly economic, climate change and health and well-being, taking a sustainability development model. But you're absolutely right. Understanding the social benefits are derived from each of our strategies is really important, and it is on my to-do list. So we will obviously draw from government guidance, but I'm hoping we can go a slightly step further than that. We haven't got it just yet, and it's a proposal obviously I'll need to make to the administration about how far we go, but it's certainly something that we need to bake into the strategies as a whole. Just to be clear, those three strategies are 10 years, so we're looking at a decade of change, and therefore we'll need to know incrementally, just as we are with carbon reduction, we've got to be net zero by 2030, so we need to incrementally know how we're going there. We'll have ambitions set for health and well-being. One assumes around inequality, although of course we haven't got that yet, so that's an assumption. And we've already got, and we're proposing a target for the economic development and where we should be in 2030, and we need to know that we're going to be on that path to get there, and then what are the social and co-benefits of that, so by the time we get to 2030 we can refresh and think what next. So yeah, absolutely, I hope that helps.
Thank you for that. As we kind of round this off, I'd just like to put a recommendation to members just to see how you all feel about this. We've spoken about strategy and vision and all of that stuff. We know that a set of case studies was presented to the council on best practice on transport. I'd like to sound you out on whether you think it would be a good idea to recommend to the executive member for transport that those case studies be made available online on the council's website, so that people can, members of the public, residents, community groups, etc., can see for themselves examples of how other cities are tackling transport issues. Would there be, people have thoughts on that? Would you support the idea of seeing this information being available to the public, since we've had all that work produced for us by the Civic Trust? Councillor Fenton.
Well, if the work has been done, I'm presuming by the Civic Trust.
Yes.
Have done the legwork. I don't see whether it's on their website or with a link from our website in some way, shape, or form. I can't see a reason why that information wouldn't be shared unless there were some intellectual property aspects to it, but I can't imagine there would be.
So assuming that the Civic Trust were happy for that material to be made available to the public on the council's website, you'd be happy with that. Is that anyone? I'm not seeing anyone dissenting from that. Julian, is that technically possible?
Yes, there's no reason why it wouldn't be. Yeah.
Good, that's good to hear. And so if we can make a note that we'll recommend that the executive member for transport ask for those case studies to be published online. Thank you. Yes.
Just one final point. The cost per tonne of carbon emissions as used in the Zebra bid for 2022 was £27.24 per tonne emitted, which is a value that rises so that by 2030 it's over £80 per tonne.
Thank you for that. Okay, we'll move on to I can't call it, we're having two main courses today, basically. So we're moving on to our second main course, which is to look at the current draft of the climate change strategy. Sorry, would you like to have a 5-minute comfort break? Yes, if everyone wants that. Yep. Okay, 5-minute comfort break. Thank you. Welcome back. We're ready to move on now to agenda item 5. Who will be presenting? Is it you, Claire? Okay, fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So once again, Claire Fole, Assistant Director of Policy Strategy for those who have just joined us. We're here today to present the draft climate change strategy, which responds to the council motion to be net zero by 2030. This is a framework for the city. It's been developed in consultation with the city. Indeed, consultation will continue throughout the summer, as noted by Julian, as part of the local transport strategy development as well. It draws on evidence, science, national policy, and draws on an understanding of the attitudes of residents gathered through the survey last summer. We know there are gaps. If we do all we can now, we will reduce emissions by 54%. This strategy provides a framework that has the flexibility to adapt to emerging policy or technology over the decade ahead. It is not a finite. It will grow and flex as we move ever closer to net zero. This framework is designed to help city partners and residents consider the impact of their actions and consider their options when contributing towards our shared ambition of net zero by 2030. As you've noticed earlier, with the council responsible for less than 4% of the total carbon emissions, this council alone cannot deliver net zero on behalf of the city. It will need to be a joint and collaborative effort with all of us working together. Where we know of emerging policy, we've already incorporated it. For example, as Julia noted earlier, we need to reduce transport emissions by 71%. We're already delivering an EV strategy. Just last week, as Julia noted, we announced more electric buses and already have in place the e-scooter and e-bus trials, and we're working to deliver EV charging points to support private electric car ownership. Where we know of gaps in our understanding, we're already seeking to address these, for example, with the local area energy planning. We will have the information we need to build business cases for future investment. This strategy also provides a framework for other council strategies and policies. For example, it is very closely aligned to the health and wellbeing and economic strategies that are still in development, as it recognises sustainable development and sets out to be enough for everyone forever. It provides a framework for emerging plans, such as the local transport plan, the skills plan, and the future housing retrofit strategy that will in itself need to encourage a different skill set that we recognise for retrofitting itself. We're really keen to listen today to your comments. We will collate them and we will take the time to consider them. And I'd just like to take the opportunity actually to thank, I think it was 6 different speakers and who provided their comments earlier. We really, I think some of them are still here. We really welcome their contributions and we've made notes. So thank you. I'll just hand over to Sean and then we'll open it up.
Thank you, Claire.
Thanks, Claire. The draft Your Climate Change Strategy provides a framework for the city in tackling climate change. It sets out our approach to reducing carbon emissions that are under our direct influence to net zero and creating a city that is resilient to the impacts of climate change. The strategy is the culmination of robust scientific evidence base and engagement and consultation that demonstrates the opportunities and challenges for York. It recognises the role of the council, but emphasises the need for citywide action and accountability. It is both ambitious, requiring a 54% reduction in emissions by 2030, and achievable, providing future scenarios that are based on expert industry and government projections. There is uncertainty as to how future technology, national policy, funding and deployment rates will develop, but this strategy provides both flexibility to adapt to these developments and focus, with 32 clear objectives that we can collectively work towards. The case for action is emphasised by highlighting the economic, social and environmental co-benefits of meeting the objectives in this strategy, and its development has been aligned with the emerging economic development and health and wellbeing strategies. This is a draft document and another round of public engagement and consultation will be taking place between May and August to shape the final version. This phase of engagement will be both targeted to groups that were underrepresented in phase 1 and broadcast to all residents, businesses and stakeholders. Finally, I'd like to make a correction to the report which was published online, which stated that the Executive Member for Environment and Climate Change has approved the draft. The Executive Member has not and cannot approve the draft. This can only be done by full council, but the Executive Member has provided agreement for the draft to be progressed to the next phase of engagement and consultation.
Okay, thank you for that. Who wants to dive in? Yes, Councillor Melly.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, I don't completely understand the kind of revised timelines. Do you mind just going through them again? Because I think we were expecting it to be signed off by the executive member in June and then full council in July, with another round of consultation before then.
Excuse me. Yes, so you're right. The revised timelines moves it back to a engagement activity throughout the summer. September executive to hopefully recommend that council adopt it, and that council will then adopt it in October on behalf of the city. That's the intention, of course. One of the reasons we've moved it back is to make sure that when we go to the city and we go to particularly residents and businesses to engage in the climate change strategy, they also have the opportunity to consider the transport strategic themes and the economic strategy at the same time. And that's because, and as we've recognised throughout the course of these different scrutiny committees, how intrinsically linked economy and transport is with climate change.
So does that mean the economic strategy has been pushed back as well? Because that was originally supposed to be approved by full council in July, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
so they're all going together, that's right.
So why have they all been delayed?
The economic strategy had, the person who's developing it had some illness and it delayed it somewhat. That's basically the size of it. Okay.
Councillor Fenton.
I'll, I suppose, just put forward some comments, really, having read it, some of which are fairly sort of technical, others less so. I suppose where I started from when reading the strategy was who the audience is for this. We know from the outputs of our big conversation from last year that they were quite, so they gave me some hope in terms of it. It suggested that a large number of residents understand the nature of the challenge we face and were prepared to kind of engage with behaviour changes. So I think that provided me with a degree of hope. I think it's now a case of moving on a step and explaining what the potential implications of those necessary behaviour changes are. So I think that's how I kind of approached it, in terms of, well, if that's a job it has to do, does it do that job in terms of informing and in terms of I suppose setting out the scale of the challenge. So I suppose one observation is, don't be afraid of setting out the scale of the challenge in fairly stark terms, because yes, including references to the wealth of scientific evidence is important, but trying to draw it out in I suppose in as many everyday scenarios as possible, just to reinforce the message that that doing nothing is not an option. And focusing on, as well as sort of transport that does get a lot of attention, giving shining a light even more on what we need to do in our own homes, and the information pulls out that 32% of the emissions that we're looking at here come from domestic properties, and that's in terms of focusing on where individuals can make a big impact. It might be worth unpacking a little bit, where we talk about high ambitions and talk about wanting to go further, depending on technical funding and capacity constraints. It might be worth unpicking that a little bit, because I think I understand what that means, but I don't have a sense of how insurmountable or otherwise the technical funding and capacity issues might be. So I think maybe just unpicking that, so it doesn't come across as a kind of sort of as an aside. There's mention made of KPIs. Obviously, they are going to be critical in terms of measuring our delivery of the strategy. And there's a reference to a technical annex, but maybe incorporating some examples within the body of the document itself, just so it's whether they're RAG rated or however they are presented, to I suppose bring to life the fact that there will have to be metrics against progress will be measured. Page 29 talks about moving away from gas heating systems. Can you mention oil heating systems as well? There are still a number of council buildings that are still oil fired, which isn't great, and they should be the priority for progress. So don't overlook oil. I like the kind of where we are, where we need to be. If we can make that look more interesting, I'm not a graphic designer, so I won't tell you how to do that, but there are people who can. Maybe a third column saying where we are, where we need to be, what some of the challenges might be, what some of the opportunities might be, what getting to where we want to be might look like. Just in every, what would it mean for me going from this percent to that percent? What will it mean? What will it mean to me? Pictures. Page 9, there's reference to an action plan, which isn't part of the draft strategy itself, but it's referred to in the sort of HR implications bit of the covering report. So if so I'm guessing there will be there'll have to be something sitting alongside the strategy that will contain the KPIs and be the vehicle for the reporting. I think the governance bit is quite good because it kind of underpins how it gives comfort that it's not going to be that's a nice strategy, put it on the shelf and forget about it. But yeah, I just noticed reference to an action plan and thought, oh, where's that? So it might be worth just explicitly mentioning that in the draft strategy itself, maybe in the governance bit. So those were just a few observations from.
Thank you, Councillor Fenton. Have you got a supplementary point, Councillor Millie?
Yeah, well, I was going to say that I've seen in the Ford plan that there's a climate change action plan due to go to the executive member for climate change in May. And I was also wondering what that was and how it fitted into this strategy.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. There is an action plan going to exec member decision session in May, and that's demonstrating the progress that's already being made in light of the strategy not being adopted yet, and demonstrating that we are delivering actions to reduce carbon emissions across the city. It's covering about the next 18 months, but there are some longer term actions on there, and to the fact that it goes up to the next election period, and everything in that action plan is budgeted for and can be delivered by then. The action plan will need to evolve and develop as it moves beyond that and goes into delivering on the objectives within the climate change strategy, but it's a starting point for us all to start working from.
Thank you. I'll make a few remarks now, if I may, and I want to preface this by saying I know how passionate you both are about this and how hard you're working on it. And I want to be clear about that. I have to say I'm disappointed by this document. One, because there is no action plan, and we've just heard reference to an action plan. Well, I suppose that's one of the keys to this. I've been talking to an international climate change policy advisor in the past couple of days, and they defined what a strategy was to me. And I suppose I know you'll know this, but they said to me, a strategy defines priority measures. It quantifies the carbon reduction of those measures if fully implemented. It sets out how each of those measures will be implemented with timescales, how much it will cost, where the money will come from, and the process for measuring that the implemented measures are delivering the expected carbon savings. And I know that you'll recognize that that's a definition of an action plan and a strategic document, because after all, a strategy is a detailed plan for achieving success. In this document, we hear repeatedly that we're a leading city, but I think in our hearts, we all know we're not. And I know we want to be, and I know the passion that there is across all the politics and across our city to achieve that goal. But we need to be honest with ourselves. If we look at the CDP, isn't it, the list of leading cities, the A list of leading cities in the world, There are 11 cities in this country on that list. We're not on that list. And there are reasons for that. And I've been checking out the carbon action plans of other cities that are on that list. And I imagine you both know these. The city of Sunderland's now on the A list. And their action plan is very, very clear. I would recommend it to anyone. It goes through the strategic priorities, and under each heading, renewable energy generation or transport or communication or governance or everything else, it lists numbered actions. It then has a name for the action, a project reference, the project, what it's about. It then has the status of the project, whether it's a concept or in delivery, which directorate in the local authority is responsible for delivering it, the service area in which it'll operate, the timescales in which it'll be delivered, whether it's a council target or a city target, the benefit to the council carbon footprint and the benefit to the city's carbon footprint. And it does this for hundreds of different actions. And I suspect that's why it is on the A list. And I've also looked at Nottingham's carbon neutral strategy. And similarly, they've got chapters, here's one on the built environment. And it details the current activities. It has case studies. In fact, one of its case studies is set in the Netherlands. They're looking far afield. They have the objectives, the opportunities, the benefits, and then they too have a chart showing all the objectives, the actions, the timescales, the priorities, all of that. And I know that you both understand all of this just as well, in fact, much better than I do. But we've not got that here. And that deeply, deeply frustrates me because there's political consensus that this needs to happen. And I want to know how we can get there. I really want to know how we can get there. You know, we have in this document the fact that we've reduced our carbon emissions by 35% or whatever that figure is. We all know around this table that that's down to the decarbonisation of electricity. We know that it's down to the EU's regulations on the energy efficiency of products. And both of those things have transformed electricity and have created the reduction in carbon that we're seeing in this city and across the whole of the country. We can't surely not claim that as one of our successes. Surely we need to fess up that we've got a huge amount to do, as Councillor Fenton has said, and Councillor Melly, we've got a huge amount to do, and we need to apply ourselves purposefully to the scale of the challenge when we say a 71% reduction in transport or a 54% reduction in heating. And I'd just love to hear from you how you think we're going to be able to communicate that purposefully to all the stakeholders in our city in a way that lifts us up rather than throwing us down at the scale of the challenge. So just some opening thoughts on that would be really welcome. And I'd love to give you the opportunity to express how you think we can do this.
Thank you, Chair. I think that the separating out the strategy and the action plan is a really important and valuable step for us, actually. I think the strategy is about setting the framework for the next 10 years and making sure that every stakeholder in the city buys into that strategy and knows that every action, every policy, every decision they take has an objective that they're working towards on that. I think the action plan is a different document that's a live document demonstrating what's in progress or what needs to be in progress. And I'm really pleased to say that the action plan that will be coming forward to the exec members decision session includes all of the metrics from the examples that you've just read out and is a very thorough list of what's being delivered and what will be delivered across the council and wider across the city over the next 18 months. So I think we're well on the way to producing what you've just described today.
So when will that be coming to this scrutiny committee for us to look at?
We can bring that to the next one. So going forward, what we'd like the scrutiny committee to do once we've got the strategy to bed is actually monitor and scrutinise the action plan. So actually you'll see the activities in train, you'll be able to call and discuss any one of those, but also is it enough? Are we going fast enough? What else can we do? So using action really and scrutinising action rather than just strategy.
So will we be seeing, for example, we've seen in this document the ambition for deep retrofitting 21,000 homes. Are we going to see in that action plan annual reduction targets that get us to that 2030 target?
What you'll see is action that's being delivered now and over the next 18 months around home retrofit through our home upgrade grant scheme, through local authority delivery schemes, through the social housing decarbonisation fund. So projects and actions that are currently funded and being delivered and are in progress right now.
And for the future, so I understand what you've just said there, but so for retrofitting, if we've got a target of retrofitting 21,000 homes, what's the timeline, the zero carbon pathway on how many homes we're intending to retrofit every year in order to hit that target? Is that part of the action plan?
Well, that detail will come out of the housing retrofit strategy, and then that will form an action within the action plan.
So will we be seeing that next, once it's
that
gone
will
to
go
the
on to the action
member,
plan, and then it can be
what we will
scrutinised.
seeing?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, Councillor Fenton.
Thanks for that clarification. So as I understand it, the action plan that's coming to the decision session is sort of a progress report on the already in train schemes, and that could act as a template for the action plan mentioned here, which, as the chair suggested, will need to have kind of what the end point is in terms of the target, and then so it will be obviously looking at what has been achieved, what's coming in the next 18 months, but also we'll need to have that destination target as shown there. Because I mean, just picking up in the draft strategy under the governance heading, it talks about open and transparent reporting, assigning responsibility, tracking actions, and monitoring progress, which are the right things. I suppose having mentioned the other strategy documents you've seen, it'd probably be helpful to kind of share with this group that kind of next iteration of of the action plan, so that this group can feedback whether it thinks it covers all the things that we think it might, and also potentially, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, having a if the destination point is the high ambition target, some indications to whether is there likely to be a technical capacity or funding opportunity that might enable that to be that target to be stretched. So
yeah, absolutely. And officers monitor delivery of the action plan through an internal program, an operational program, where we also look at the gap. So if we take retrofitting housing, obviously there's a load of actions being undertaken at the moment to try and get as many homes as possible retrofit using a number of different grants that Sean's just spoken through. However, we'll get to a point where we've expired those opportunities and there's a gap. Well, we need to then think about how do we fill that gap, and we'll obviously bring that to this group for proposals. So it's all live. The action plan is designed to be live and continue to be live throughout the course of the next decade, essentially.
Thank you. Yes, Councillor Perrott.
Thanks. Sorry, it was just a point to follow on from that, really, about the sort of governance and monitoring. So I know there have been concerns expressed in the past that just regular sort of citizens of York haven't really been able to get involved with things like the Climate Commission. It's sort of an invited group. How do residents, how do groups like trade unions that haven't been involved with that sort of hold it to account as well? Is it just going to be coming to this scrutiny committee for us to sort of represent their views? Is there a mechanism for us to sort of allow every citizen of York to have their say on it and sort of hold us to account, because some of these things are going to be difficult to achieve, aren't they? And I think we need to take people with us, but also make sure that people keep sort of giving us a prod if we're not going far enough and fast enough. So I don't know if you've got any thoughts about how that would work as well.
Yeah, I think specific questions to the Climate Commission are probably better directed to the Climate Commission. I don't want to speak on their behalf. But you're absolutely right that accountability and transparency would be really important. And we are currently publishing annually carbon emissions, both associated with the council's corporate operations and through the citywide emissions inventory as well. So we reported that for the first time last October, and we'll be doing that every year, and it will be available on the council's website and through the York Open Data platform.
Yeah, and obviously we've got just to add to that, in York we've got a very open decision making and scrutiny process. So today we're being webcast. We had 7 different speakers come along and share their thoughts. We've got the executive decision session. I want to say the 9th of May, I might be wrong, but that's a public session. So all of the times that we bring climate change issues to members for scrutinising or decision sessions, they are themselves public and open forums.
Yes, Councillor Barrett.
Sorry, if I can just, sorry, I'm forgetting to take my mask off. If I can just follow on from that, I suppose the concern with that, and I mean absolutely no disrespect to any of the public speakers, but the people who come are really passionate, they're really engaged with this. It's how we get it to a sort of broader forum, because it's not necessarily the people who can tell us all a thing or two and sort of, know far more about this topic than your sort of average person that you'd meet on the street does. It's sort of how do we get them involved with holding us to account for this as well. And I suppose, yeah, there's the normal democratic process, but every scrutiny committee could probably do with having to think about how we get, more people engaged with it. So I don't know if there's anything that you can think of that we could do if it's part of ongoing consultation, if it's done annually as part of big conversations. It just feels like this is a really important one for us to try and get views that aren't just the sort of typical ones that we hear from quite often, because we do have a lot of speakers who come sort of back again and again to this forum, and I just don't want to miss out on everybody else's voices as well.
Can I take that away and not give you an answer off the cuff? So I'll spend some time thinking about that and come back to you. Thank you.
Councillor Barnes, I think you
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Nice to hear examples from Sunderland and Nottingham, 2 Labour councils. I'm sure just coincidence. But no,
we're doing so well.
Joking aside. I agree with the sentiment of many of the speakers, really. And just as the Chair said, this is not a criticism of either of you. I think, though, it probably is really important that we feed back at this stage, whilst it's still a draft document, that if this is the best that we feel we can do after 3 years of work, then certainly my view would be that our best isn't good enough. I was never of the belief that we would, I thought net zero by 2030 was very ambitious, but not to be Paris aligned tells a real story. And I'm sure it's probably a challenge that many authorities would struggle with, but not all. And I think there will be outliers who are willing to really dedicate all of the powers and levers and go the extra mile. I think they will probably be outliers, though, and it's a shame we're not in that category. In the meantime, they're not being Paris aligned. Really, the message is that our best is not good enough. And I think going into an election year when we've made that commitment is interesting. And I suppose, is it incumbent on us to be writing to, I don't know, Department for Levelling Up, Community and Housing, to be able to say, look, we feel we've pulled every lever we can as an authority. We've unturned every stone. We've worked with the business community, with residents, and the best we can do is 54%, which leaves a delta of 22% to be Paris aligned. Government, this is the challenge that we as a local authority feel we're facing, and we're looking to central government, I guess, for answers.
Yeah, we absolutely need to be ready to capitalise on new opportunities that present themselves from new scientific endeavours, new emerging technologies, new policy frameworks that present themselves, and conversations and lobbying with national government is certainly part of that requirement to be ready and to force hands if need be. Yes.
Supplementary for me. So would we feel comfortable as an authority? I appreciate this is draft and subject to its finalisation if we're still sat on 54%. would we feel comfortable submitting it to, you know, Deluxe for scrutiny to say, look, we feel we've done our best and our best isn't good enough. Tell us where we're going wrong as an authority. Why can we not become Paris aligned? To me, that's really important, because, you know, if we've come through this exercise, we're confident we've done all we can, but we just cannot become Paris aligned. I think there's an important message to central government there.
Yeah, Councillor Fenton.
Yeah, and I suppose it's it's why it's important to have you've got to the higher ambition trajectory and understanding what the gap is, and partly why I talked about unpicking the reference to technical funding and capacity issues, because I'd like to think if those issues were easy to resolve, then we would resolve them within our own means and not have. But I think the fact that we're kind of saying that there is this gap and we're acknowledging it, I think is important. I think we shouldn't go out of our way to kind of rubbish the achievements that have been made through the hard work of residents, communities, officers, and we all recognise that, you know, the things that we've done are nowhere near to where we want to be, and that's the whole point of having a strategy. But, you know, for their glitzy and impressive documents, I don't know whether Sunderland and Nottingham were successful with their bus service improvement plan bids. So we may be doing better in some areas than other authorities. In other areas, we can learn from what they're doing. So I think we can learn from whatever the political complexion of other authorities. I'm sure we can learn from all of them, and be proud of what we have achieved, but certainly not complacent, and be willing to learn and adapt, which I think we are.
Yes, I'll just make a quick intervention, if I may, Councillor Perrott. So to develop what's been said there, and what's being said around the table. I think one of the issues is if we focus on what we're doing, but we're not measuring it against a carbon reduction target, then we'll never know whether we're achieving the goal that we've set ourselves. So we asked the question earlier of transport, you know, are we measuring everything that we're doing? And to develop it a little bit, I'd like to refer to one area of all of this in transport, electric vehicles. So at the moment, as I see it, all our eggs are in one basket. We have hyperhubs that are, I think, if I'm correct, you can correct me if I'm wrong, we have 205 public charging points in the city when they're all working. But I understand the hyperhubs are not yet working. What interests me about all of that is that I believe we have 15,000 homes in terrace streets. And I don't know how many cars there are on those terrace streets, but do we have that data? Have we modelled how we're going to get 15,000 people, say 10,000 of them have cars, how we're going to persuade them to switch to electric vehicles to the tune of 89% of them by 2030 on the basis of a single mechanism to encourage them to switch to an electric car, because we all know they can't put cables across the pavement. So what I'm wanting to get a sense of is how will any action plan be able to respond to circumstances as they move forwards? How open will we be to using lots of different methods in order to reach our goal? How quickly will we be recording? You know, do we know the carbon benefit of all our electric car charging points at the moment? Are we projecting the value of them in 3 years' time? How does the action plan engage with the substance of those kinds of challenges? And how do you see it working going forwards? Sorry, that's a bit long-winded.
Oh, so you go.
So lots of points there, Chair. I'll try and address, well, I've noted
Yes, I'm
two
sorry,
down,
I
so I'll
went-
try and, yeah. When it comes to quantifying the impact of the projects and programmes in the action plan, we are doing that where we can. Collecting carbon emissions data can be challenging and it can be expensive. So we need to take a proportional approach. So the larger projects, we are definitely and absolutely quantifying. Smaller projects where the cost of monitoring becomes more expensive and delivering the action, it's just not practical to quantify the impact of every single project. On the EV question, we have a current EV strategy that we are working towards. I think it's a 5-year EV strategy. If you want to know more about it, I'm sure we can bring in the experts on that. But what this strategy does is that it provides a framework so that when we're next updating that EV strategy, it's designed in a way that delivers the objectives of this strategy and produces actions that are aligned with our net zero ambition and reducing carbon emissions out to 2030.
And are you confident that the action plan that will exist for next year, because we're talking about agreeing one in the next few months, are you confident that we're yet at a point where the computed carbon reductions for the year ahead will deliver the trajectory that we're setting?
We're talking about the action plan that will come in May?
Yes, yes.
The action plan that comes in May delivers the actions that are currently funded and are in train. It will need to be a live document, it will need to be updated, we'll need to add actions to that to deliver on our net zero ambition.
And so we've not yet, presumably we're setting a pathway with steps down to
precisely
net zero, but we don't yet know the degree to which those actions are contributing to deliver that target.
That's right. So we need to do that gap analysis,
Right.
which will then inform the next action plan. And the next action plan will need to know where the funding's coming from. So where we've got opportunity to seek investment, where we've got opportunity to use council funding, where we can work with city partners to do different things. So the action plan we've got now tells us the actions that we are delivering now, that this administration and this the council has currently made choices around, for example, active travel, the housing retrofit programme, the housing delivery programme, all those different big programmes, as well as carbon reduction projects that Sean's team are working on, such as solar for schools, etc. So all of those actions have been brought together and quantified and laid out, and all the different metrics applied to each of them, just as you spoke about with Sunderland. What we don't know is how successful those actions will be, because we're measuring them as we go. But we will know by the point that the funding needs to be re-questioned, we'll need to then know how much more funding we need to deliver on this action to allow us to get to that point. So it's absolutely live all the time, because there's no way we could develop an action plan that would be consistent for the next 10 years. We don't know what funding will be available next year, let alone, in 5 or 6 years. But what we do know is the types of things we need to do, because we have the framework now in place. Obviously it's going through consultation, but we do understand the gap. We understand the targets we need to do for each of those different objectives. That allows us to make more informed choices, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we know that the councils that have projects on the shelf are the ones that get the funding.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Councillor Perrott.
Thanks, Chair. I wanted to take us back, I suppose, to some of the things that the speakers had said. So I know that the high ambition was a phrase that wasn't particularly well responded to, but also one of the speakers had mentioned about vision. It was something that chimed with me, because I didn't really get a sort of clear vision. I don't know if this is just a sort of politician thinking, if I was on the doorstep, if I was saying to somebody and I had 30 seconds to sort of grab them and say, this is where we're going, this is where we want to get, because I think, there's a lot of change that's inherent in this, and some of it's got to be quite radical. It's going to really shake up the way that we live our everyday lives, but there is huge opportunity as well. And I just don't know whether or not we've sort of communicated how we're going to do this, what the benefits are going to be for everyone if we get there, if we make some of these changes, which will be really, really beneficial. And I also wasn't really clear how we do that sort of just transition, sort of looking at who is going to be left behind, why are they concerned, sort of how do we pick them up and sort of protect them to some degree. You know, if we're talking about retrofitting, there's an awful lot of people in households across the city who desperately want to do some of those measures, but would never be able to afford them. Might have private landlords who would refuse to do it because they don't want to invest in the property. It's how do we speak to those people who are probably going to feel the most left behind by this? You know, if they are reliant on cars, if they're a care worker, getting on a bike's not an issue, not an option for people. We had one speaker who was talking about accessibility needs, and you know, how do we communicate this vision? I suppose I'm just kind of looking for an easy story that is this is our sort of end goal, this is where we want to get, and this is why it matters, and this is how we're going to sort of protect people and sort of make sure people aren't being left behind by these changes. So I guess there's going to be more of this, and it might just be that I'm quite a visual person, so I can see there's a big gap on page 17 where there's going to be a little bit more sort of themes and objectives wise that's easier to see at a glance, sort of what we want to do. But for me, there just wasn't that sort of narrative around why it mattered that I think is the thing that connects best with people. So yeah, not an easy one for me to sort of throw at you now, sort of how would you encapsulate that? But is that something that we could look at including, just even in terms of putting it in an action plan? You know, we need to talk about this strategy sort of briefly, don't we, for it to sit with all these other documents. But the executive summary for me was quite wordy without really giving me that sense of what is the end goal here, what do we want to achieve, what is this overarching vision. So yeah, sorry, that ended up sounding very negative. I am sorry, there's an enormous amount of work that has gone into this, and I really do appreciate, because you know, this level of detail has to be there. It's just how do we, you know, elevator pitch wise get across in 30 seconds, oh yeah, I'm from City of York Council, this is our vision, this is how we're leading on this is what we want to do. And I just don't feel we've got that sort of concise answer yet to that kind of question.
Yeah, so thank you, Councillor Perrott. That's obviously comms and engagement question again, which like I said, I do want to think about. I don't want to just like sort of shoot from the hip, really. We have got an ambition, which is net zero by 2030, but that's a what, isn't it? It's not a why. So I take your point that we haven't really described the burning platform enough to say why people should make those particular changes that, going back to Councillor Fenton, would show those scenarios of what does it mean for me. So we'll take that away. I've probably made an assumption that actually, you know, the different reports that come out that keep telling us that if we don't do something tomorrow, we're all going, you know, the world's going to end, and you know, all of that stuff is enough, but it's not, is it? So thank you. We'll take that away.
Yes, I'll just make a quick point and pass on Councillor Barnes. Yes. And I just want to look at, I'll give you a list. I've drawn quite a long document on my comments on the strategy, but just to pull one of them out in relation to what's being said here. There's a list of 5 principles. And I'd like to suggest that on the list of partners, we should also be including residents, voluntary organisations, disabled organisations, trades unions, and a much broader group of people. I do worry that we seem to have got ourselves into this area that it's big organisations that talk to each other and people at the top of things that matter and make decisions. We've raised the issue several times over the past year and a half, 2 years, and I think it needs to be made again. That I cannot see how a strategy can work if you just talk to the employer and never to the employee. I think we need to have a broader vision for our city. And then the second point, and then I'll pass over to you, Councillor Barnes, is again, it's on how we communicate, because Councillor Perrott has talked about how we're communicating. When we went through our big conversation last year, we were asking people questions like, are you prepared to use your car less? I think when this strategy is agreed and goes out to consultation, it needs to be asked in very different questions. I think the strategy document needs to be engaging with vision and ideas. And I think the kinds of questions I'd like to see us asking, and I'm happy to hear what others think, for example, to car owners, will the proximity of electric car charging points to your home influence your willingness to switch to an electric car? How would you like to be able to charge it? How frequent a public transport service would you need to have to feel comfortable about not having a car? Would it have to be every 40 minutes, every 30 minutes, every 20 minutes? Would a bus station that enabled faster connections to different points in the city encourage you not to take your car? I think we need to be asking more questions that are about shaping the future, rather than questions that invite people to describe their present, if that makes sense. So I'd like to see that. I'd like to hear your views as to whether the strategy will be doing that, and views obviously of members as to whether they support the idea that it should.
So we haven't developed the full proposal for the RB Conversation 2, which is the engagement in the strategies themselves, but we'll take that point away. It picks up on Councillor Fenton's point about future scenarios, really, doesn't it? To show, like physically show what that looks like. Yeah.
Yeah, it's about shaping the future rather than just talking about where we are. Councillor Barnes.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I get that this isn't easy at all, and I've heard what you've said about the gap between the 54% high ambition and Paris alignment. And Sean, you said that obviously there's a lot of unknowns in terms of future central government policy, funding that might come with that policy, innovation, and that's absolutely right. But I suppose put myself in the mindset of a business, right? If they're setting a 10-year strategy or a 5-year strategy or whatever, they don't say, okay, we don't know what's going to come in the future, therefore we'll go with what we know we can do. They set a target for growth, and then they set out, if you like, a sort of hypothesis, how are we going to get there? And of course, you know, you'll fail against some measures, you'll succeed against others. And this is not a criticism of the two of you at all. It's a suggestion that I think we can do more in terms of living with that uncertainty, but nevertheless plotting a path to, surely the end goal has to be Paris alignment. And then you reverse engineer a plan from that, and you deal with the uncertainty and the unknowns, and you accept that there's a level of risk in the strategy that's being set out. This really, it's unfair to direct these comments at you, really, they're directed at the executive. And I hope they will be shared via minutes and via the chair with the executive. But that has to be the starting point, that we have cross-party consensus, we have IPCC warnings on the need for this. Failure is not an option that we should be politically willing to accept. And therefore, the start point has to be compliance with Paris alignment and a reverse engineered plan. And then, if I may, in that context, what I'd like to focus in on as a practical suggestion is one of the elements in the strategy, in the draft, which is the section on investors. Now, I know, we all know, government policy says, and the CCC says that in order to achieve this, we're going to have 1.4 trillion of investment between now and 2050. That's not going to be government investment, that's clearly stated. And some of that private investment that needs to be leveraged will be through initiatives of central government. Some of it will and should come through local government seeking to engage investors. And for what it's worth, I would suggest we could do much better than 2 sentences or 2 paragraphs under the investors section. I would like to see much more ambition there in terms of, you know, what we plan to do, how we plan to engage with them, who are the private, you know, what sort of private investment are we going for? Is it venture? Is it you know, institutional investment? And what are the things that we're going to try and partner with private investment to secure? So I think, yeah, much more vision, ambition, acceptance of risk and uncertainty, but setting that end goal as Paris alignment and talking about how we're going to work creatively, rather than just waiting for innovation or waiting for central government policy to prescribe. That would be my 2 pennies worth to the executive.
I might be able to lift your heart a little bit here, Councillor Barnes. As of 2 weeks ago, the North Yorkshire Pension Fund has switched £140 million worth of investment to a climate opportunities fund. And you can rest assured I've been banging away at that for 18 months. But it's an indication of a changing mindset at local government pension fund and institutional investor level. And so I agree with what you're saying. I think there is a rapidly changing understanding of the role that institutional investors have to play. And if we look at 7,500 council homes that we will have to retrofit if we're going to reach net zero for the council, at a cost of £20,000 each, that's £250 million. So somewhere we're going to have to get to grips with how do we talk with those investors and create financial models that work so that they can put money into retrofitting those homes, and the savings that are made in terms of money as well as carbon are split between the local authority and the institutional investor in order to make that happen. And the same thing can be said for private homes. So I'd agree 100% with your analysis. And I think we need to show that kind of vision and be bold and confident, because we are in an amazing city. And I'm sure there are plenty of institutional investors who would like to have a part to play in all of this, and they will be earning a return. The North Yorkshire Pension Fund isn't investing £140 million in climate opportunities because they like tap ears. They're doing it because they've been persuaded that it will deliver a better financial return than the other things.
Exactly. I mean, just to say, Chair, completely endorse what you're saying. And as you know, it won't just be the pension fund, it will be private investment alongside that. And we can't guarantee any of that. It's not necessarily our core function to be doing that, but I think we can, I suppose we can do more than a couple of paragraphs in setting out our stall and talking about joint venture opportunity, and just really set out our ambition, because I think there is investment looking for, from what I hear speaking with sort of investors in green tech and green economy, that there is more investment than investable schemes available, and it's a challenge for the investment community. So using our position to be able to sort of influence, convene, bring people together and show that there's clear ambition here is the first step, I think, in terms of leveraging more of that.
Yeah, it's true to say that the Climate Opportunities Fund that the North Yorkshire Pension Fund is part of, we're part of a pension pool that includes 11 local authorities. The fund that was made available was 1.3 billion in size. And North Yorkshire Pension Fund would love to have invested twice as much as we were allowed to have invested it, but the whole fund is oversubscribed. And so it shows that the world is changing quickly. And if we want to be in there, we need to be declaring our position boldly. Councillor Melly.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think when it comes to external investment, a lot of it is to do with changing market and there being new market opportunities for companies to make profit. And I think personally, I'd be in favour of the council looking for those market opportunities, as you know, as well as just opening it up to private companies to provide services where, you know, it's private companies where the first motivation is profit rather than service. Whereas if it's possible for a private company to provide these services at a profit, presumably the council could, and that might make up for some of the, you know, gap. You know, maybe if you have modal shift away from cars, there'll be a loss of car parking revenue and that sort of thing. But if private companies are able to make a profit from using council-owned assets such as lampposts to retrofit them to be suitable for car charging, and yeah, if private companies are able to make a profit from that, then surely the council can run that as a service and maybe also get some income. Same with anything like bike hangers for people who don't have anywhere to store a bike at home. If we want modal shift towards active travel, if private companies are able to make a profit from installing bike hangers and renting out spaces, then the council can surely do that even better with the focus on service and possibly also have some income. Like there's going to be loads and loads of opportunities like this where private companies are being creative and coming up with creative ideas. I feel like the council should be too, and not only relying on external investment in that way.
I'm going to make one more comment, but I just want to, before I do so, invite Councillor Wan, and you've been very quiet, just to invite you to have the opportunity to contribute to this, so that you.
Honestly, I've been listening to what everyone else is saying. I completely agree with a lot of the sentiments. for me, when I read the strategy, I thought it was missing an action plan, and we've heard an explanation of the fact there is an action plan coming. I would just ask for that to be a smart action plan, one that's very definite in the way that it spells things out, that it says who will deliver on those things, that it's time bound. I just think without that, we're on a hiding to nothing. The only other point that I was going to make was already raised. It was about electric vehicle charging points, which I did ask last time we met about the hyper hubs. They're not available and running. The one at Poppleton Bar probably is running, but it's not accessible to the public because it's been subsumed into a COVID centre. And the one at Monk's Cross is just sitting there. There doesn't seem to be any electricity going to it. So it's not useful for anybody to charge their car at the moment.
Thanks. I have one more little set of questions. I know time is running on. We've been kind of, as we always are on this committee, because we're dealing with such massive things. Points have been made about investment. And I'd just like to extend that a little bit further to the business community in general in the city, and ask whether the strategy might say more on how we're going to engage with city centre businesses, because I feel we've got a really important part to play here. And I'd just like to hear your views as officers to this. I know that there are other cities that create plans for procurement that enable them to work with shops in their city centres to transform the glazing of their shop windows from single glazing to double glazing or triple glazing. In this city, we've got an incredibly energy inefficient city centre. Can this strategy have something to say about this city's understanding of that situation and commitment to working with city centre shops to transform the energy efficiency of their buildings, whether it's glazing, whether it's using joint procurement to help purchase heat pumps, whether it's working with a street of shops to find a solution that will help reduce the carbon emissions in that street. What can we, and of course the other part of that is the role that the City Council has to play in changing the planning framework in order to encourage shops to be able to do those things, rather than having them all dreading putting in a planning application because they'll be told, I'm sorry, your single glazed shop front looks so lovely, we don't want you to have an energy efficient shop. Or and another planning thing might be, how can we use regulation to require all shops to keep their doors closed in winter, which happens elsewhere. I know, having worked in a city centre shop, that the anxiety for the person in the shop is, if my door's closed and next door's open, I lose trade. So would you agree that there's a role for the City Council to engage with regulation, with planning, to help transform the energy efficiency of our city centre businesses?
Yeah, there's certainly a role there. The local authority, as the chief planning authority, has an important role to play in enabling that transition. One of the actions on the action plan is to produce a sustainable supplementary planning document for sustainability and climate change, which provides recommendations and advice for anyone that's retrofitting, refurbishing a building, or creating a new building, how they can go beyond conditions and regulatory requirements, both building regs and in the local plans. There is advice and guidance there. We also acknowledge that it's a balance between conservation and sustainability. York's a lovely place to come because the buildings are fabulous. That's one of the reasons, but there's a growing need to retrofit beautiful buildings and do that with consideration for the built environment. So we will be producing guidance on what types of retrofit actions are permitted development, which ones they might need to seek consultation on, and which ones might be looked on less favourably, so that we can steer building owners in the right direction.
Great. Well, I mean, I think what's clear from this is that we need to see the action plan when it's available at this committee. As soon as that's available, I think we'd all like to comment on that. And your comment on historical buildings just reminds me that I think York Minster are now working on a proposal to put solar panels across the roof of the cathedral, which I think would be a fantastic step and show real leadership on climate issues. So unless anyone has any other points to make, I think we've exhausted ourselves. Thank you to you both for coming here to present all of that. I'm happy, if it's helpful to you, to give you copies of these, though I'm sure you could get your own copies of the Nottingham. And yeah, if there are other members who would like to just get an idea of what other cities are doing, you're welcome to take a copy of this. And thank you all for your participation and all your contributions, because I know we are making a difference, and I look forward to seeing the next iteration of all of this. Thank you.